If you're not familiar with I4CP, we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're a human capital research firm. We focus on discovering the people practices that drive high performance, which we define through four pretty standard business metrics: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. Through our research work that we do, both qualitative and quantitative, we like to tease out what HR practices high-performance organizations do far more often than low performers. And we provide that back to our member organizations through reports and calls like this. We have exchange groups, infographics, checklist tools, you name it. As I said, we're a member-based organization, so special welcome to anyone on the call who's with one of our several hundred member companies. You see just a small sampling of some of the logos here. They range from very large organizations like Amazon, Microsoft, 3M, Visa, and others. They also range across all different market industry verticals, including a growing number. We have a nice cohort now of sort of startup companies, unicorns, and so on. So special welcome if you're with a member company. If you're not with a member organization, welcome to you as well. If you'd like to learn more about what membership entails, just reach out to any I4CP employee after the call today or visit our website. There's complete information there as well. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP. And today my co-host is my fellow senior research analyst and Minnesotan, Katheryn Brekken. Good morning, Katheryn.
Morning, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you as always. I think it might be because of you that we've got you've got a lot of fans up there in Minnesota, even though you're north of the Twin Cities. But good to have you with us, and you'll be leading the conversation with our special guest today in just a few minutes. Wanted to note the upcoming sessions we've got lined up. You see we've got HR leaders from Bank of Montreal, Citi, and ServiceNow coming up on April 25th, May 2nd, and May 9th. These sessions are weekly, as the name implies, every Thursday at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. So hopefully you can join us for those. We also record all of these sessions. So if you're relatively new to this series and want to see what you've been missing out on, they're all out at the website, i4cp.com. We've been running these now for a few years. You used to have different cadences, different approach, but the entire archive is available going back to 2020 when we first started this up early during the pandemic. Also want to note that we do have some sessions on different days of the week, also open to the public. These are geared time zone-wise, more for our colleagues in the APAC and EMEA regions. Anyone's welcome to join, of course, but time zone-wise, they're best suited for those folks. So if you work for a global organization and you have some HR colleagues located either in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Australia, I'd encourage you to share this link with them. Again, all available out at our website. Cover a lot of the same topics: culture, talent acquisition, DE&I, learning and development, you name it. Great guests. So please share that with your global colleagues. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Katheryn, to lead the conversation today with our colleague, Mr. Rob Cross.
Thank you, Tom. I am thrilled to be able to do this today. For those who don't know, I've been working with Rob for the past couple of months on our upcoming team effectiveness study, which is going to build off of sort of what we're talking today as well. And so it's a pleasure for me to be able to put you on the hot seat today, Rob, going forward. Can you start off by telling us briefly about yourself and your career?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Katheryn's been very patient with me and kind of bringing me into the fray and how we do research at I4CP. So I'm just glad she's still smiling and with me in all of this. But it's been a huge privilege to be able to work with her and really the whole team at I4CP and curating that research. The work I want to share today is some things that actually was what we call evergreen research. It was things conducted over the course of 8 or 10 years looking at what is distinguishing more successful people. And by that, I mean people that get and stay in the high performance category in organizations in terms of how they were collaborating. And the thing that really cued it for me is there's so many people, when you say you need a network, it's almost always about go meet a lot of people, right? If you, even the technologies, the social media platforms, that's the implicit assumption is that kind of more is better, all the self-help books, all the guidance. And as we were looking through this analytically, in a way I'll introduce in a minute, we were finding that just wasn't true. right? We were finding that, in fact, there's usually a negative relationship between just knowing a ton of people and likelihood of becoming and staying a high performer. And so that inspired a lot of the organizations that we've worked with to develop these ideas, to really back away and say, okay, what's unique about what these people are doing, and how can we look at it analytically first, and then as a product of interviews that we've conducted with hundreds and hundreds of these people.
Well, first of all, I think you could back up, talk about Babson College and like your years of research on this topic, but then how have you gone about studying this issue? I know you use a lot of organizational network analysis. Maybe you can explain what that is as well.
Yeah, great question. And so just for people unfamiliar with it, network analysis is a way of being able to assess patterns of connectivity in groups. And just to level set for a second, I know some people will be familiar with this, some people not, and I just want to use this as a device to kind of give people a sense of where these ideas came from analytically. But we have developed over about a 25, 26-year period a way of mapping who's interacting with whom in organizations, and using that to then see how is work getting done that way, right? And so we're used to thinking about, hierarchy as a way that is dictating who reports to whom, how work is getting done, sometimes process maps. And this was just a different way of being able to see how collaboration is driving, different kinds of impact. So on the left, we're showing a formal structure, who reports to whom, things we're used to seeing. And then on the right is an informal pattern of collaboration. And there's a line between two people if one or the other says, this is a really critical source of information to get work done. So super simplified example, right? There's way more sophistication we can apply to this. Usually we're looking at much, much, much bigger groups, 10,000, sometimes 100,000 if we're focused on culture change. But what it allows us to do is to start to get a different sense of, for example, where influence might exist, in organizations, and understanding typically what we see is about 3 to 5% of the people account for 20 to 35% of the value-added collaborations. It's a lot more, a smaller set that matter than we oftentimes realize or see. And if we compare our lists of who the key contributors are, the key Mitchells of the world, and there's never just one, if we're looking at larger groups, there can be hundreds, even thousands of them, and we compare our list against the company's lists of who they have in their top talent programs or getting the biggest bonuses or things like that, there's typically only a 50% overlap, right, between the two. And so just as one quick example, it can be a really powerful device to say, for example, if you're not acknowledging Mitchell and the work that they're doing, they are far more likely to leave, we know. And when they do, it has a much greater disruption than just the human capital walking out the door. It's the way the group was executing. So, we use the ideas to understand that. We've also done a tremendous amount of work in understanding how to use speed inclusion in networks, whether that be newcomers, inclusion programs we're trying to kind of influence. And you get very different insights when you start to see, not just do we have people in the door, but are we getting them positioned well in networks in ways that can enable them to execute. And it allows us to see silos, at certain points where collaboration's breaking down. And for me, the idea is never, ever to go back to places and say, people need to, collaborate more indiscriminately, right? If I asked how many people on this phone call wanted another email meeting or phone call in their lives, there'd be no hands that shoot up, unless you're the new person, right? That's just kind of getting settled in there. And so that was kind of what we were going against with all this, is you don't just go and say we need to bridge every silo, which a lot of the programs we employ do, but rather to be super precise on where are these breakdowns happening that could give us scale benefits, give us innovation benefits. So this is work we've been doing for 25, 26 years, in over 300 organizations, again, much bigger groups than what I'm showing here and much more sophisticated on that. And this work really teed up when a lot of the companies that we were associated with started saying, we're really interested in what high performers do, right? Those people that get and stay in the upwardly mobile category performance. And what I was seeing over and over again is most of the programs and most of the ways we think about it implicitly assumes a big network is a good one, but that's not what we were seeing, right, in the research. So what I would do very tactically is we'd run our analytics, and then we'd get separate performance data from the organization. Sometimes that may be rapid promotion, sometimes it may be bonuses, other elements like that. And then we were really honing in very deeply on what high performers do, right? And it turned out that the first thing that was distinguishing those people that were more successful was never the size of their network. Usually there's a negative relationship between just knowing a lot of people and likelihood of success. The first and most significant thing was the efficiency of it. So they tended to be interacting in ways that bought back about 18 to 24% of their time, right? When we looked at these analytics. And of course, that got everybody's attention, right? And when Harvard wanted to do the book on this, that's how they titled it. You know, it was Beyond Collaboration Overload, because they want viral terms and things like that that'll get people's attention. But that was really only half the story. And what I want to emphasize with the group here today is this was ultimately a study of leaders that were delivering enterprise value. Right, that was the screen we kept looking through, is where do we see those leaders that are making substantive things happen in their organization, where 90% of the groups are grumbling about misaligned incentives, you know, time zone issues, groups that don't work together, things like that. There was a small set that was really delivering, you know, significant results. And a part of it had to do with how they created space and time, right, that enabled them not to fall into a reactive posture and be just firefighting, right, in the moment. And then a really significant part of it had to do with how they use that time to curate these broader networks that enabled innovation, to be a source of energy that enables scale. There were very, you know, unique things they were doing in those networks that enabled them to deliver scale. So that's the thing I'd underscore, right, with this, is it was ultimately a focus around those leaders that are delivering what most places want right now, you know, enterprise value, one firm leaders, things like that. It was how they're doing that as a product of the ways they're collaborating.
I think one of the most exciting and enticing things about this illustration right here is, you know, the getting back time idea. I remember the book. It starts out with someone who's really struggling with overload, and you know, it's having a negative impact on his career and his family life. Can you speak to that for a moment for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll share that story, but also emphasize to the audience that this was, you know, 600 interviews. This is one of 600 that I did, and you go through that number of experiences with people and feel the kind of stress and overwhelm. It really gets in your soul after a while, the degree to which people are struggling to keep up because of how hyper connected we are in different ways. We don't see that because the first 10 minutes, especially if you're a successful person, and all these people generally were rock stars, right? I did all the analytics, and then I interviewed 600 people, 300 women, 300 men, and they were all successful. So the first 10 minutes of every story was, oh my gosh, it's great. And then you keep, you know, going down and starting to get a sense of how difficult, right, it is for these people to keep up. And that was kind of the story of Scott. He was one of the first interviews. Now, this isn't, you know, a real name or real face, but it's a real person that was a part of this. And he had been super successful, you know, in an organization, very well-known life sciences organization I won't mention the name of. He came in and didn't do anything substantive in the first year or so. He was on a new product development initiatives and things like that. But then he got put on one team that, because of that success and derivative successes off that, he flew up the hierarchy, right? And so it was a fantastic success story of somebody that over about a 15, 16-year period was presumed to be one of the next contenders to move into the C-suite, if not be the CEO, right, at some point. And so what we were doing in there was using the network analytics to map the top 10,000 people and see where are these pinch points happening in decision-making interactions or other things that are slow in getting therapy to market, right? That's $1.5 million a day, if not more, if you can shave off time, right, to market there. And that's what our focus was. And I was talking with them about this and about to go into the boardroom to present on these results. And the CEO pulled me aside on the way in and said, you know, I really want you to look at Scott's network, because we're about to have to remove him from the role he's in, right? And it really hit me as a surprise at that point, because everybody had just said nothing but amazing things about Scott, right? People loved him. They thought he was, you know, iconic leader. All the things you could say that were positive about him was the feedback I was getting as we went through this. And the CEO saw the shock on my face a little bit, and he said, I have the same reaction. Like, everything we can see that he is doing, right? A highly inclusive leader. He's taken layers out of the hierarchy, very participatory in decision making. You know, all these things are what a contemporary leader has said they should do today, to be inclusive, to be everything like that. And yet on the other side, on the performance side, he's missed growth strategies in Asia. He is not, not coming through on commitments to his peers, and they're grumbling about it. Engagement scores in this group is plummeting, and we can't reconcile the two. right? And he was saying, we need you to take a look at this with this lens and see if that's what's happening to him, if it's the way he's collaborating, right? And so what we found in this moment, this is a hairball, right, of a network analysis, and I won't dive into all the nuance here, but we obviously parse in different ways. But he, in this one group of 1,800, he ran 3 groups, one of 1,800 and 2 others of similar size. He had 118 people coming to him frequently for information, and another 78 that said, if I can't get more of his time, I can't hit my business goals, right? And so he was really struggling to keep up, very reactive. I'd get emails at 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. to set the times to speak with him. And physically, when I met him, you could see that he was just, wrung out, right? And so to your point, it was having a significant impact on his career. And as I delved into it more and more, it was his life that was being affected too, right? On a personal level and in many ways there. And so what he did, and what a lot of people do, is the tendency a lot of times when we get overwhelmed is we start thinking about the big things, right? That one project that's killing us, or the one leader that's driving us crazy, whatever it may be. But we think about the big things because cognitively, that's how we're wired. What I find that the success comes from here is more focusing on the minutia, right? What are the small moments that have crept around us that are consuming our time, that in the moment we just do it because it's easier to do than restructure, but it's because of the way it's accumulating around us today that it's problematic. So for him, what he focused on is said, what are the interactions that I'm getting pulled into that I'm not adding unique value to? It's just become everybody else's expectation that I'm going to participate in these HR decisions or be part of this decision-making forum. And the reality is I'm not adding any value, and it's sucking my life away, from things that I could be doing. The way he looked at this to find this was he went back in his calendar and email 4 months and just, was looking for what are the routine decisions I'm getting pulled into, the routine portions of my role that I don't need to execute, and are there different meetings I can extract out of. And then what he focused on was not giving that to the most busy person around him, because that's the next really big mistake we make, is when we shift things, we tend to just go to the people we know and trust deeply. He was looking 2 layers out and saying, where's the talent that I'm actually trying to pull into things that we can use these smaller moments for them to build credibility, right, and move into the network. Had a really nice effect, right, of pulling him down and engaging certain people and starting to create capability there. So part of that was, how was he putting structure into the role versus being structured? And it's something that I'm always urging people to think about. So often we get into points of collaborative overload and we say, I don't have any control over it. And the reality is we do, we give it up a lot, on the margin. We don't kind of pay attention to it as much. And then the second thing he did was really to think about, how am I creating the problem? And as I went through these 600 interviews, that was probably the thing that surprised me most. Was I thought when I started the collaborative overload work that, if we solved time zones, emails, nasty bosses, and demanding clients, right, that would be the whole ball of wax. But I came out the other end with all these interviews realizing that about 50% of the problem is we all feel pressure to jump into situations. And a lot of times we jump into them in ways that aren't helpful to us, right? So for some, it's a desire to help that leads them to jump in the moment. For others, it's a desire for accomplishment. For some, it's fear, right? Others, it's fear of missing out. And the more that we're aware of and guarding against those triggers that lead us to jump in, the better we do, right? I know for myself, it's a desire for accomplishment, right? If I see a 5-minute window, I will try to jam 60 minutes of stuff in it, ignore 3 hours of coordination I should be doing. And the crazy thing about it is it never bothers me in the moment, right? That 5 minutes, I feel great because I feel like I've just done something. Where it comes back to me is 4, 6, 8 weeks later, and you've been through this with me recently. You've seen this in real life where you have misalignment or you have other things, and you're like, I started that to begin with, right? And it's like that for everybody. Everybody has these triggers, whether it's a desire to help, accomplishment, status, other things like that. For Scott, it was a really strong desire to help, right? He saw being a good leader as being somebody that helped and helped directly. And if you do that directly and not helping in a way that builds capability, the natural conclusion is you're going to get overloaded today, right? It's just not possible with all the ways we collaborate in different ways. But the way it would look for him was really crazy, right? And so he would be copied on these emails, like 20 people on them, and people would say, we should go to A. And then somebody would say, we should go to B. And what about C? And no, what about D? And he would inevitably jump in at some point and say, has anybody thought about E? Right, or a different course of direction. And what would happen, and we could see it in the analytics, is suddenly the people were managing the issue and they were managing him, right? And so suddenly he was having more emails coming to him, more meetings on his calendar, more back channel stuff to try to get alignment. And when I showed him this, he just burst out laughing and said, I never cared about the direction of these things, right? I was just trying to show these people I was present, right? And it was causing this overwhelm, 4, 6, 8 weeks later in ways that he couldn't see. So I'm setting this up in depth to give people on the call a sense that these are actually two really important categories of things we can control, right? How we're putting structure into the situation versus being overstructured, and how we manage our own tendencies to jump when we shouldn't actually is a really big part of what creates overload. So I'd love to just, get people's reaction in chat if we could for a moment, or just with emojis, right? If you've seen, Scott's situation, either you're falling into it, you've seen people that are drifting into it, please, pop an emoji in, or where you see Scott's challenges in your own work, right? Accumulation of small tasks, too many meetings, overload of emails, IMs, desire to help, right? Driving overload. I'd love to just see people pop that into chat as well. And I'll pause here for a second and just see if there are any questions, any things like that I should be reacting to as well.
The very first person that chimed in, Monique, said, yes, I've seen it in the mirror, meaning herself. So I thought that was an interesting first one.
That's funny. That's the hard part about this game sometimes, is you start recognizing, how much we're our own worst enemy in different ways. But the good part about it, and I say this a lot, is we do have more ability to control what we do and who we do it with than ever before. And the challenge is that we are too quick to give it up, too quick not to be clear on where our unique value add is. And there's a lot of small levers that can help with that one.
Katheryn, what's jumping out to you with some of these responses? I see some people saying they see it with senior leaders. Well, one person said see it more in their personal life. What about you?
Yeah, I'm definitely agreeing that I think there's a lot of people who are relating to this personally, and this idea of being a helper. I think also personal values play such an important role as well as an organizational culture, which Deborah brought up, to be a helper. Like I'm like Thomas the Train. I want to be of use. And when I'm of use, like I get this immediate feeling of loveliness, energy, if you will. And so I jump in, right? Probably to get those sort of endorphins or whatever. But being cognizant of the fact that that's not the most, efficient, and it's going to make me stress down the road, I think is a really big deal.
Right. And I think it's, what I would hear about the strong desire to help people is quite often they didn't even have to be asked to help. They would just jump in, where they saw a need because of what you just said, right? It's a strong, feeling of impact. And what was usually important in that category was being really clear on saying yes means saying no to something. Right. And being very clear on what that no meant, right? It's either professional aspirations that it's going to take you away from, or it's being present personally, right? In spheres of your life that it's going to pull you away from. Sometimes you may make the decision, but it was a heuristic in the moment that helped people a lot of times, be more clear in this. If I were to look at, one idea that I thought is so critical in all this, is the people that I interviewed that were better able to articulate what are the capabilities I want to be using in my work in the coming 5 years, and what are the values I want to experience, right? And now they would never say it to me that way, right? They wouldn't say, here's the capabilities I want, but they would say, it's really analytical work I want to be diving into. It's a certain form of coding, or it's a certain, way of engaging in creativity. They were just really clear, right, on professionally what's the trajectory they wanted to be on. And they were really clear on what are the values they want to get from work, right? Is it mentoring? Is it innovation? Is it social justice? What are they using work for? And those were the people that were far more likely to be able to do that saying yes means saying no equation, You know what I mean? Versus if you're in a situation and you're just thinking, well, I just want to get to this role in the next 3 years, or I'm just trying to survive the next 3 to 5 years, you don't have an anchor on what's important, right? And it has a big impact on how we get sucked in different ways. So I think that's important from a perspective of, you know, your own self-awareness and my own self-awareness too, right? On how I jump into things because I can get quick wins. I think it's a really great thing for leaders to be thinking about in one-on-ones. And most leaders should be looking at this and saying, I have people that are falling into A, B, or C, and I should be coaching against that, right? If I want them to stay around, not get burned out, be productive, you know, all those positive elements.
We have a question here from one of my favorite people, Mike Manning, from FM Global. He notes that, and yet this is what it took to get Scott to become a C-level successor. Would he have reached that level without, you know, doing these things? Do you need to do this to get to that level and then change? What are your thoughts?
It's a really awesome question. I found in this work that there are points of transition, particularly, you know, in promotion or when people took different jobs. And this is, you know, the whole idea of what got you here won't get you there, right? Won't get you successful going forward. I found that those were the really significant points to be reflecting on, particularly like these small moments. Am I getting pulled back into interactions that are not healthy for me in this new state, right? Or creating your own inflection points if the portfolio of work you have has changed dramatically. So as one example of that, we could see very commonly, it was a big failure point for leaders to rise in the organization, and they would continue to hold with roughly 60-65% of their trusted ties back where they came from, right? And so that would become a big anchor in their thinking, right? At a point that they needed to be more structurally diverse on who they were listening to, who had their ear. They would have this influence that was as important a bias as any cognitive decision-making bias, right? Because it was how information was getting to them. So I think it's a great point, right? I believe there are transition points that matter for performance and effectiveness there. And I also found it in the book I just did around well-being. You know, you would see these transition points in people's lives where 90% of the population would come back and say to their significant other, you're not going to see me for the next 6 months, right? I have to, you know, figure this new role out, get it done, blah, 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 blah. And they would slowly over time become smaller versions of themselves, right? They would be letting go of things that kind of kept them whole, activities, you know, things outside of work and that sort of thing. What was really cool is about 10% of the population, they would lean into the transitions and say, this is the ideal time to shape other people's expectations of what this role is versus falling into patterns of expectations. And it's actually a great time to become a slightly larger version, you know, of myself. And they always were more successful, right? If you kind of backed up and followed their career forward, they were richer versions of people in terms of what they'd accomplished and what was in their lives.
We have another great comment in the chat here from esteemed John Boudreau. So excited you're here, John. But to his point, he talks about, he's back in 2007, Pete Ramstad and I talked about return on improved performance. The key question is not what's important, but where would improving performance make the biggest impact on our key outcomes? He says, I find that shifting to that second question changes a lot in how people think about who is vital and what to work on and what it means to have a talent strategy. Sort of interesting take on your work as you're talking about.
I mean, the way that and John and I've talked about this in different ways, the way that I would apply that is very focused on who are these inflection point people. You know, John was very good at seeing the pivot kinds of roles and work that needed to be done. And this is just an extension of that and saying, you know, in this case, Scott was an inflection point person, right? It was not just his performance and well-being that was struggling. It was 78 other people that couldn't get their job done because they didn't have access to him and the way he was executing this role. And again, for me, what I think is interesting about it all is it was all coming from a good place, right? It wasn't somebody that was hoarding or wouldn't delegate. It was actually coming from a place of, I want to be the kind of leader that's helping directly versus transitioning off of that to Mike's point around how do I help in a way that's building capability versus solving people's problems, right? The earlier you can start doing that, the less likely you are to kind of end up in this position.
So let's dive into one of these areas of overload. Can you
Yeah.
tell people a little more about how you make this actionable?
Yeah. So, and there'll be access to a toolkit that I want to show you in a second that we'll put over for people. And I want to just spend a minute here and do a poll with the group and get a sense of this. But we looked and saw that there were three categories of things that people were doing that enabled them to buy back time, more successfully in their roles. One was how they put structure into their work. Two was how they manage their own tendencies to jump in. And three was tactically, right? In terms of how they leverage technologies, how they use meetings, other things like that. If we looked at the structural piece of it, I described one example of how Scott, just reflected back in his calendar 4 months and said, what are the routine things that have built around me that I need to shift out and away from me? That's one strategy of 8 that we see people doing that actually kind of impose structure into how things are getting done versus falling into a reactive posture, right, overall. And so it can be, what I've already mentioned in terms of clarities on expertise and value as being a really important thing to then shape the nature of work that's going on. It could be blocking time and calendar for reflective work, right? Just to kind of buy these blocks of time back. There's a whole set of strategies here, but what we wanted to do here was just do a quick poll with the group, and I'd ask Zeta to open this for a second if she could. And what I'd love for people to reflect on is if you were to pick one of these actions in terms of how you're putting structure into work versus being structured, that could have the greatest effect for you. Not what do you do well, but what could have the quickest impact for you. What might that be? And let's take, I don't know, Tom, 30 seconds on this. Is that right?
Yeah, let's give folks at least 30 to 45 seconds because they need to read through each of these actions. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share out the results.
It did confirm. So block time is one of the quick things that people can grab a hold of, and it's something that everybody says I should do. They don't do. They give it up in very important ways. The reason that matters, though, because it's a smaller strategic idea in context to some of the others. The reason that matters is we feel overload as a volume problem. It's just the number of emails, meetings, phone calls, IMs, everything coming at us from the second we wake up to the second we put our phone down at the end of the day. But what we also discovered as we went through this is it's very much a switching cost problem too. So just the act of looking down at a text and back up, the studies in the cognitive psychology world show that's a 64-second loss for most people to get back on track, just from processing a quick text, maybe responding to it. If the disruption is so great, that you're moving across, say, Teams channels, Slack channels, things like that, and you have your train of thought lost, or schema that they would call it, that can take up to 20 minutes to kind of fully come back up to speed with what you were thinking about. So part of the problem with this is it's not just a volume issue, it's the fragmentation issue, right? And the fracturing that's happening here that actually has quite a bit to do with it. What we've seen in this work is a couple of times a week having 90-minute blocks. In the studies that we've conducted, it was almost linearly associated with productivity, right? Is really significant for things that you see in the wild. Or people would choose not to block the reflective or strategic time, but they would choose to block the distracted time, right? So they would go back and say, look, I'm going to be on these channels for 30 minutes, 3 times a day, but I'm not going to be always accessible, right? Because it's going to disrupt my ability to get things done. However you do it, and whatever rhythm you manage to, that was the other interesting thing to me, is some people would prefer to jump on, for example, emails first thing of the day to get them out of the way. And I'd go to the next interview and they'd say, have you lost your mind? If I start on emails, I'll never get off emails, right? And so for them, it was a discipline of really focusing on the thoughtful work they needed to do early and then letting the fray kind of take over. So that whatever you do, though, we see the people that are putting a structure, into the rhythm of their work this way is really important. And there's a lot of subtleties to it too, about how you recharge during the day, small breaks, things like that can come into play. The thing I'll say that to me is really important too with this is you see that block reflective time got 25%. You also saw that every single thing was chosen. right, in here, and some in, greater or lesser proportions. If I were to say what's the single most important thing statistically, it's this first one: clarity on expertise I want to use and values I want to deploy. We've had millions of people come through this card sort that we'll make available to everybody, and it turns out statistically that that's most associated with people that are happier in their work and doing better in their work. But you look at this, and if I had said, here's the one thing that everybody needs to go do, because I'm sure people on this call are just like, God, Rob, just tell me one thing, one thing I need to go do. If I said that was the most important, it would miss 91%. Right, of what people are saying is important here. So the structure of what we're doing is really honing in on saying, how do we get people down to the 2 or 3 things that can be most impactful for them? And I think this idea of going after the biggest beta weight, right, or the biggest driver, oftentimes hurts us because we're not getting the right ideas down to the right point in organizations. So I'll move us ahead here for time's sake. And what we've done with this, and we'll make available, is boil these ideas into these digitized cards that enable people to go through and say, what's most significant for me to be paying attention to? And so what you can do with these, we'll just show this live for a second, is you can go through, and the red behaviors here, these are not just little cards built, in an office by myself. This is a product of 600 interviews and kind of going through and seeing what are all the practices that these people are doing. If you go through in terms of how they put structure into their world, right, it's a series of things. And we saw that make unique contribution was the second one picked. Clear priorities, standing meetings, calendar strategically. Not just with what was neat about these people is it wasn't just with a 1-week time horizon, but it was typically 2 months out. So they were getting much further out and setting up the meetings they needed to be a part of or wanted to deploy, and were pulled into work that they wanted to be doing. So what you can do with this when you get it is you just go through the cards, you can flip them over, see what's a little bit more about one area you may want to pay attention to. There's a 3-minute video with each of these that's just talking about, here's the issue and why it matters. Here's somebody that does it really well, and here's 3 things you could go do Monday, right? And so what people do with this is they'll grab 1 or 2 in each category and then pull that down, and then you can generate a personalized report off of this, right? And so it just gives you a chance to think about how do I hone in on a couple of areas that are going to enable me to be more successful, right, in my work. And this kind of popped up midstream because it's in there, but you can see this is what the report looks like. Here's the 4 cards that we just pulled, right? And it goes into to more depth at different points there. So, I say that because there are different ways we can drive these ideas through teams, and we're focusing a lot on that right now, is how do you create different norms of working together. But this is an incredibly tactical way to see what are the 3 things I should be going and doing that is incredibly pragmatic. It's not a matter of waving hands, or it's definitely not a matter of people saying, I'm not going to collaborate, right? If anything, my enterprise leaders were collaborating more, but the way they were doing it is what was buying time back.
So they're able to buy this time back. But then you learned a lot about how these enterprise leaders also use that time, that new time, to build networks, right? Can you speak more about that and why that's so important?
Yeah. And to me, this was the most important thing. And it's one of these things as an author that you bump into, is titling decisions get made without your participation or with very little participation. And everybody at that time was grabbing hold of the collaborative overload ideas, right? And how do you buy back time? Rightfully so, right? But I think the real magic actually was in the second half of all that work and saying, well, what do people do with that time? Because that was what enabled people to really scale. It was the unique way they were spending that time on a broader time horizon, ways they energized others that had the bigger impact. What I find in general is a lot of times when we just get efficiencies in our work, we tend to spin ourselves back up at a more rapid pace, right? And most people have had this happen through the pandemic. I would be doing these interviews pre-pandemic and people would say, Rob, I can't get anything done. I've got 8 one-hour meetings, right? And I can't get anything done until the children are in bed and I'm working late at night. And, somewhere, somehow through the pandemic, there just was this collective movement to let's all go to 30-minute meetings and then 25-minute meetings, right? And so now the situation's much worse because instead of 8 one-hour meetings, we have 16 30-minute meetings. It's more taxing on us in the meeting. It's harder moving across them as rapidly as we are. We end the day with a to-do list based on 16, not 8 meetings. So we're working 4 to 5 hours more into the night, further into the weekend, as a product of just increasing the velocity, right? That's what I wanted to avoid. And it was a battle at different points to make sure that we were heavily focused on what are these people doing with the time that's enabling them to scale themselves, in essence, right? And there are 2 important things, I think, on that. One is the successful people. Second biggest predictor of a successful person, and to me, that means somebody that gets and stays in that upwardly mobile category. They're not blindsided, they're progressing, over time, was that they tended to have a diverse, structurally diverse network, and never not a big one, right? Only in very transactional work like residential real estate sales did the pure size of the network predict success. So I use the Kevin Bacon, example lightly here because people are familiar with him. And I'm not saying he's a good actor. You can make your own call on whether you think he's good or bad, but he is well connected in the movie universe. When you look at this question of who's appeared in movies together, right? You can create a big map of all the co-appearances in Hollywood. And it turns out Kevin's pretty connected, right? He's actually not the most connected. Usually it's Rod Steiger. But the reason he's connected is not because of the number of films he starred in, but because of the number of genres. Right? So whereas most actors or actresses have been in one genre, like a Jim Carrey in comedy, others, Kevin's been in family, action, drama, comedies, and it's those bridging ties into the genres that are those clusters that make him more central in the movie universe. And what we know is, I'm not saying he's a great actor. Again, you can kind of make your own call on this, but when we look at this analytically in all the organizations, having a network that was more like Kevin's was the second biggest predictor of a high performer. Having a network that looked more like Jim's, where the people that you're spending time with are connected around you, that was the biggest predictor of not a failure point. These people weren't getting fired, but it was a big predictor of them falling off the upwardly mobile category, right? They tended to not be in the next round of promotions. And a lot of it, tied down to them just becoming more insular in their thinking, right? They're just used to seeing their problems a certain way, relying on the same people over and over again. So what was important to me in that, as I went through these interviews, is I've known that, and social psychology's known that for a long time. Ron Burt was really probably the originator of that idea many, many years ago. But it's a really hard thing to operationalize, right? It's a hard thing to come back to a group like this and say, just go to a lot of meetings with people that you don't know or whatever, meet a lot of different people. And so as I went through the interviews, excuse me, one of the things we were focused on is tell me about a career-defining moment in your life, right? A time when you just crushed it performance-wise, that became something that put you on your upwardly mobile trajectory, right? And then what I focused on was not what those people did, but what was the role of the connections around them, right? How did they leverage people in a way that got them scales? And there's 3 important things that are super actionable that I'll pass along to the group here. One is the people that were more successful, they tended to spend a little bit more time in exploration than their average peers, right? They tended to spend about 15 to 20% more time maintaining calls, setting up, maintaining, and keeping calls in their lives. So they're just reaching out to other areas and saying, how are you doing this? How could, I benefit you, you benefit me if we shared kind of practices? They'd be reaching to other areas in an organization and seeing, are there ways that we could be working together in a way that would let us deliver greater client value, right, in consulting or investment banking. And what would happen over time is if you did enough of that, you stop seeing your problems through your narrow lens, right? You actually start to see problems coming at you and you're like, gosh, if I included, say, Katheryn in this, Tom in this, maybe we could do something bigger collectively. And that was one of the biggest drivers of these people's success, their high performance, was that they were producing a bigger outcome, and they were doing it in a way that was actually building a network that then pulled them into opportunities, right? And it started this kind of upward spiral. I thought that was unbelievably cool because most people look at the networks and they say, oh, that person's just political, or they're lucky, or they know somebody. And that may have been happening in the 70s, but it just isn't what we were seeing, right? It was more this product of how do I scale myself and deliver something greater as a product of the network I'm in. And the other big thing we found is none of these big moments, that become our career defining moments very rarely came in neon lights and blaring horns and like, pay attention to this. It was almost always when you have 8 things going on, this 9th thing goes by, and you would find that some people would lean into it, right? They would follow somebody back into an elevator. They would turn around in a meeting as they were leaving, or call somebody right after and say, what if, and they would just kind of tease this idea apart. It was almost always the case that those were really big accomplishments, but they never started that way. So the reason I'm saying this is, what do you think are the first 2 things that we start to stop doing when we get overwhelmed collaboratively? Right. And for most of us, it's these 2 things, right? The first thing you jettison are these exploratory meetings, the things that kind of allow us to expand and see things more broadly. And we get very reactive in small moments. We don't lean into it, and explore it, whether it's at work or at home. Right. And so that's part of the magic of this, and why I array this on the infinity loop is, we find if you're not doing things programmatically to help your leaders buy back time, you can't go and just tell them to go build bigger networks, right? It'll never work. You have to find ways first to say, here's how you can secure time back. And then here's ways to invest that time, right? In certain ways, in kind of the process of time. And then what we would see very clearly in all of this is, as work formed into projects or other things that these people were doing, they were far more likely to start building networks around that work that sped the way it was implemented, that helped them supplement skill gaps, that helped them be more innovative in the work. None of this happens if you've fallen on your back foot, right? If you've gotten reactive, right? But if it does happen and you're starting to deliver greater results and doing it in a way that's building bigger networks, you have more ability to push back on small things that are making you reactive. Right? And so it's very much a kind of upward spiral that we'd see in this. We have toolkits on this that people can pull down or we can share, but it's a real easy thing to think about. Am I building connections? Coming 6 months, core work projects I have, am I built connections in these 4 categories that are going to help me, implement more efficiently, scale myself in different ways.
That's so interesting. And I have to say, because the buyback time in your book it's not always too about work. And I know we didn't talk about this ahead of time, but can you talk a little bit about dimensionality and having those sort of 2 to 3 groups outside of work and how that can help with balance? That was such a pivotal, meaningful moment for me in the book when I learned that.
Yeah. I mean, that's what, and it was part of my soapbox too, because you go through 600 of these interviews, and many of them were very successful people, and they'd come close to the end of their career, and some of the stories were just horrendous. They would be like, I've been through 3 divorces, children that don't talk to me, and irreparable health. They'd made a lot of money, but they just stories that were like, holy cow. And a lot of times they would say, it's been hard, but I'd do it again. And I remember sitting in some of those interviews going, really? That's a horrible story. I didn't say that to the people, but a lot of it happened as they just allowed themselves to become slowly very unidimensional, right? And life became just about work and identity built through work. And they would justify that by being a provider, right? And saying my family has to have, and the provider role never gets met these days, right? It's always bigger. And so in contrast to that, what we found about the people that were doing better is that they tended to have at least 2 and usually 3 groups outside of their profession and direct family that they were an authentic part of, right? And that introduced a lot of dimensionality into their lives. It just kept perspective for them. So they were a lot happier, in terms of the scales we were looking at, and thriving and well-being and things, because it makes sense intuitively, right? When you have these other things that are identities part of your life, you're willing to push back on those last 10 emails a little bit, right? Because I need to go do this. The vagaries of work, right? Or family, being upset with you don't feel as impactful. And those people, they were feeling better, and they showed up at work better. Right. They showed up in ways that enabled them to be more creative, enabled them to get more followership in what they were up to. So I appreciate you asking that.
Yeah, and it's a nice segue to the next question, which is really about how leaders get influence without using authority and create scale by generating energy. and that creative energy you
Yeah.
just talked
And so a
about.
lot of it has to do with some of the ideas in these grids that we use to say, core projects coming 6 months. Who do you need to be reaching out to? Because it's more than just formal stakeholders. The stakeholder matrices are not reflective of what these people were doing. They were much more likely to get to influential people like Mitchell's in the early diagram early and get them engaged in the work versus trying to perfect the work and then, drive it through mandate and logic, right? There were a lot of subtle things that these people did that enabled them to get influence without authority. But one of the biggest, and this is something, we've been at for 26 years now, is they always tend to be energizers, almost always tend to be what I'll call energizers, right? And so just like I can go out and map information flow in groups and see who is turning to who for information to get work done, I've been mapping this idea of energy for 26 years. It's work that started at McKinsey years and years ago to see what predicted their high performers. And really, throughout over 300 organizations that we've worked with, this idea of energy is usually 4 times the predictor of a high performer, right? It's very predictive of people that get and stay in that top performance category. And we can use this to go out and see who are the strong energizers, right? So in this case, the blues turn out to be the more senior people in a consulting practice. And you can get a sense that some of the blues in here, they're a source of energy for other people. So this is not, am I energized, right? That's the focus of a lot of programs. That's really good, like the corporate athlete. This is, am I creating energy for others? And how does that impact, my performance? And so again, when we ran these analytics early, we were finding that across, early stage and then through hundreds of organizations, it's about 4 times the predictor of a high performer. And it's very behavioral, right? That was the important thing for me, is myself or people on my team went in and they would interview the energizers and then the energized and see what do they think's going on, right, in this interaction. And it's not cheerleading, for example, right? You're likely to see an energizer, energizer disagree as a de-energizer, but they do it in a fundamentally different way, right? Rather than say, that's a bad idea, or we've tried this before, right? Or this won't work because, before you've even gotten the words out of your mouth, they're much more likely to say, well, given where we're trying to go, here's an alternative. Right. So in that step, what they're doing is they're separating the critique from the person, right? So you don't feel attacked, right? And they're exposing their own thinking, right? And it has the same result. People are moving the discourse in a different direction, but they do it in a way that maintains positivity, right? In the discussions out there. So as we looked at this, and this is work that I also published with Amy Edmondson and Wendy Murphy, the energy ideas are important, right? A lot of people are pursuing psychological safety, and it is one form of trust that really matters in context. It's gotten very popular today as these fads kind of move through, different initiatives. And what Amy would say in this is, addressing psychological safety is taking your foot off the brakes, basically, right? It's removing a negative in organizations. It's not necessarily creating energy, right, in the context. And so the work that we were doing was very focused on what does that look like, right? If you're not just taking your foot off the brake, but you're inspiring interactions that give people a sense of purpose, a sense of energy, what does that look like? And it's a very concrete set of behaviors. For example, we know that people that create energy are much more likely to get off task early and maintain a personal interest in others at an appropriate level. That creates what we call benevolence-based trust. And it's a real kind of source of energy, right? You don't get energized in the context of people that you don't trust. And the bottom, the one-on-one conversations, we know the leaders that do much better at this, they use their one-on-ones to understand what others want to be doing in their work. And then they shape the nature of the work coming to those people, and they get more energized individuals, right? Another set of these behaviors is being just typically present, right? And so what we find is you're as likely to see highly extroverted people be energizers as you are highly introverted people. It's not associated with charisma or things like that. It is the case, though, that both those people, when they're with you, they're fully with you, right? They're not looking down at the text to see if it's more important than you. There's a constant presence that that they're showing, right? Your value, your importance in the discussion. So, you know, what we do with this in programs from a leadership standpoint is to say, you know, not do you do these things or not, because inevitably you would to have gotten here. The question is, when you're under stress or pressure, which one or two do you let slip that you want to be more consistent on, right? And there's a lot of tactics behind this that you can take forward. But it's a really big deal. The reason the energizers matter is not because they're happy people, but because they benefit from scale they create around themselves. Right? We see that the more successful people bring things to those people. Energizers tend to benefit from getting high performers that stay longer around them. You know, there's a lot of different ways that suddenly they don't work as hard as people that don't create energy or the reverse out there. Same question I asked on the last slide, though, is what do you think the first thing is you stop doing when you get overwhelmed? And for most of us, it's that we don't come into situations saying, how do I create this as an energizing moment, right? We come into situations saying, this is about me, right? I got to get my stuff done and go. And so you see kind of this interplay again around this infinity loop, right? That it's a product of, you know, how do you buy time back and maintain that? And then second, how do you make these investments that allow you to accomplish bigger things and scale yourself in ways that let you push back over time? And that to me was the really cool thing we were seeing with the enterprise leaders, is they were able to maintain this over time, not just in one accomplishment, but because of things they were doing on both sides of this equation.
Wow, this hour has gone by so quickly. Rob, thank you so much. It's such a treat to have you here and to talk about this research with you. I'm going to turn it over real quickly to Tom and Zeta to wrap us up. Just want to say thank you, everybody, for being here with us. And have a great sunny day, all my Minnesota friends.
Thank you all.
Yeah, I'll double down on that. Thank you, Katheryn, for facilitating the conversation. And thank you, Rob, for all the insights shared today. As Zeta shared over in the chat, and I have up on screen here, if you have an HRCI or SHRM certification and need recertification credit hours by attending today, you get one. So just jot down the relevant program ID or activity ID, and you'll be all set there. Thanks again, Rob. Thank you, Katheryn. Thank you, Zeta. Another great session. Folks, have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you again next Thursday. Bye-bye now.